Welcome to the Sheth Leadership Academy Lecture Series, a series of lectures delivered by Professor Jagdish Sheth, one of the top management thinkers in globalization and changing demographics. He is the author of numerous books such as Chindia Rising and The Rule of Three. This lecture is part one of User-Centric Marketing for Planned Social Change. Please enjoy.
This lecture is somewhat unusual. It is really focused on government, NGOs, foundations, and social activists who try to intervene in the society to go the society in the right direction, or at least not go in the wrong direction. This particular activity is enormously growing, especially in the last part of the last century and the beginning of this century. And it's very unusual and ironic that the more the social change taking place in the society, the more the need to intervene to counterbalance it. For example, in emerging economies, the change is so radical. In India, the generation gap is only 8 years apart. The older sister cannot relate to the younger sister, which is creating side effects or side consequences for aging parents, for example, for what being a sort of extended family, all living together, to living more like a nuclear family. Same thing is happening in China when it is beginning to shift from, or has shifted from, a communist to a capitalistic economy. Changes are happening in Africa. And this is not limited to emerging markets. Changes are happening in the US, in advanced economies, for example, by the rise of social media. Everything began after 2001, essentially. There was no Google, there was no Facebook, there was no Twitter, there was no WhatsApp or Skype or anything. And today, that whole technology effect on society is massive. Sociologists are worrying, for example, how are we becoming addicted and therefore insulated from any conversation within a family? People are doing text messaging to each other, sitting next to each other in a sofa. Is this good or bad for the society? And therefore, is there any way to intervene and counterbalance becomes very necessary. So globalization has its own impact. Technology has its own impact in social change. So are the evolutionary processes like changing demographics. When the society ages, as all advanced countries are aging, what are the side effects of that aging consequences in socially restructuring all the institutions? The institution of family, for example, the institution of government, the institution of faith, the church, etc., etc. So this lecture is on all about planned social change. While I'll talk about social change in general and what forces drives those changes, but most of the lecture will be how to intervene and how to be more efficient and effective in making desirable behavior more possible, more prevalent, and undesirable behavior, how do you eliminate or reduce it in the society? One key area of this emphasis in the lecture is that most of the social initiatives by the NGOs, non-government organizations, by in fact government policies, are not often designed from a user or a recipient viewpoint. Most of them are mission driven, whether those are faith-based organizations or those are strictly social reform organizations, and they don't take the recipient perspective. So we'll be talking about how taking a recipient or a user or a customer perspective dramatically changes in the way you begin to organize your strategies of intervention, and especially in the way you market your programs and your efforts into the society. So let's begin the journey. I've deliberately chosen the title of the presentation as user-centric, taking the view not of the donor or the grant giver, but taking the view of the recipient of the benefit of the program that you are designing. So it's user-centric. I'm using the word marketing deliberately because ultimately it's all about how do you market and take a customer perspective, and if it's a market-oriented strategies as opposed to policy-oriented strategies, it might have a better effect, better efficiency even, and this is all about planned social change. So the title is User-Centric Marketing for Planned Social Change. Actually, in some ways, this is the part of what is now called non-profit marketing, marketing by non-profit organizations. So let's first talk about what's social change. Social change is the alteration of the structure or the functioning of a social unit such as family, religion or church, business and education. Not limited to these, I'm just giving as examples. Government can also change by changes in the societal structure by and large. So here are some quick examples. With the rise of working women households and a two-income becoming almost a necessity for survival, economic survival, it is changing the whole role of women in the society. And this has a massive impact on definitely the family, for example, may have a massive impact on the business, for example. So we can study that. Online dating. Remember at one time people used to laugh about doing online dating. Today online dating is mainstream, please. It is better than hanging out at bars. It is better than, in fact, meeting at church. It is better than alternatives that we have done. It's transforming in terms of social change what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. Have you seen the rise of evangelical mega churches? I mean, they are very different than any kind of a specific branches of Christianity. Very different. I mean, to them, buying a jet aircraft at $65 million is considered quite normal. Is it really faith in the way we know? And these churches are so massive, they are global in nature. They have television programs, they have live broadcast, and they're transforming the whole faith-based, understanding, etc. in the society. We are also struggling very much about diversity at workplace, gender diversity especially, not only ethnic diversity. And of course, in my discipline, which is higher education, I find that online education, what is called the MOOCs, are massively transforming the way we will deliver education, the way we will create content for example. Most textbooks are less and less print-based and more video-based, for example. It's all online education as a major transformation of a societal unit called education. So what drives social change? There are 4 forces that drive social change in my analysis. The first one is just evolutionary, as we talked about, aging of the population, social media as they evolve, which is a technology impact, as we talked, globalization, we also talked about that one, but more interestingly, declining middle class. I've been studying this from the, I would say mid-80s roughly, and I find that steadily in advanced countries, middle class is declining and there is a rise of 2 extreme classes, which means inequality in advanced countries is rising much faster than we realized. And when the society has less and less middle class families, what happens to the society in terms of elections, politics, for example, in terms of divisiveness, in terms of debates that take place between the haves and the have-nots. At one time we thought that the haves and the have-nots is the issue between the advanced economies and emerging economies, but today we have the haves and the have-nots within advanced economy. It's mind-boggling. Nobody thought about this 30-40 years ago. Massive change, but it's basically evolutionary. Second way societal changes take place is through what is called the contagion effect. It is the spread of ideas and practices through diffusion of innovations, diffusion of ideas, diffusion of thought leadership. And this is very well studied by a very famous rural sociologist or a rural communication expert, Everett Rogers, in his classic book called Diffusion of Innovations. By studying how traditional farmers began to adopt modern farming technologies, using hybrid seeds, for example, planting in a more mechanized way, using the machines. In other words, going from sort of the small traditional farmers using the horses or the cattle somehow, as opposed to in fact using machines. Massive change, and he studied all that pretty much. We also have seen the viral video effects today. I mean, anything crazy, interesting happens, put it up on the net and it goes viral and millions of people watch, like within an hour, 2 hours, mind-boggling. So that's all the diffusion or contagion, and the word contagion comes from, obviously, the spread of contagious diseases like the flu, like the cholera. That's how the research came about in terms of societal changes. So that's the contagion forces. The third one is that social change can happen accidentally, can happen through uniqueness of some sort, can happen random forces. There is no real explanation except maybe a single event. We have seen the impact of meteors as they drop onto the earth, its impact. I mean, people talk about the dinosaurs all dying, the cold age coming, etc. And we had a recent meteor drop in Russia, for example. Hurricanes, we know quite a lot. Hurricanes have a devastating effect in the way the social structure of the geography transforms quite a lot. There have been a lot of studies done historically about the migration of people, mass migrations, because the drought in a given area somehow becomes desert, rivers dry, there is no reservoir, there is no lake, and people begin to migrate from one place to the other. So the civilization migration as a consequence of climate is also very interesting. But these are one-time events. They happen once in a while. Why they happen, nobody has any theory, nobody has any understanding. And of course, other major changes that happen by accident are the nuclear disasters or the nuclear accidents that we have heard about, what happened in Russia and more recently what happened in Japan, for example. The last and the fourth area is what is referred to as planned social change, which is the focus of this particular lecture. Planned social change is an active intervention by a change agent. Very key words, and we will define this in more detail as we go forward. For example, recently more and more belief system is that one should have inclusive growth as a mission, as a goal in economic development of all emerging economies. Or inclusive growth ought to be even in advanced countries with the disparity rising between the lower income and the higher income people. Smart cities is another major initiative, especially in China and India, where you have hundreds and hundreds of these mega cities arising, and how do you make them smart, more efficient, less congestion, more livable, etc., using technology. It's a planned intervention. And of course, disease eradications. We have already learned how to eradicate, in fact, for example, the diseases like polio. We are about to eradicate diseases like, in fact, the worms that go into the body, or the river blindness. These are the diseases that we know how they happen, and therefore how can we prevent it, and if they happen, how do we intervene and correct it. All of this is done sort of in an active intervention to slow down that particular phenomenon that is harmful to the society. So this presentation is all about planned social change. What is planned social change? Planned social change is, as I mentioned, active intervention by a change agent. Could be an NGO. There are all kinds of NGOs that we know, from CARE, C-A-R-E, to American Red Cross, for example, which is more a disaster event-based, but it does many other things. American Cancer Society, and their counterparts in other parts of the world. Government regulation tries to bring about a change toward a desired outcome. And of course, more recently, business enterprises are also cognizant that a society with problems is less useful to the business. The ecosystem has to be clean, has to be sustaining properly, and therefore intervening in a right way and correcting that system for its own survival is very important. Whether you call this as CSR, corporate social responsibility, or you call it as enlightened capitalism or conscious capitalism, the way you do business, the way you recruit people properly, invest in their health and education as your responsibility, maybe for self-interest, if not for public interest, is another. Therefore, business enterprises are also becoming strong activist organizations for societal good. And what are the objectives? Conscious policy. So this is a planned social change, is an active intervention by a change agent with a conscious policy. There's a mission, there's an objective, conscious policy with some deliverables or outcome-based really change we are talking about. And examples for those kinds of outcome would be, we will have certain amount of gender diversity. Right now, this is a big debate in Silicon Valley, where the number of women employees, especially at the professional managerial class, is so small relative to the possibilities. And therefore, each of the large organizations whether it's an Intel on the one hand, Microsoft on the other hand, Facebook, Google are all trying to recruit more and more women. And therefore, how do you encourage women to go into sciences, engineering, software in their colleges? It's a very key intervention, gender diversity. Government always is worrying about product safety laws, whether those are automobile products, appliances. Energy efficiency is a very key goal for most nations because energy is expensive but also is creating side effects like the emission aspects, etc., carbon, CO2, and therefore you need product safety laws, you need some energy efficiency laws, and of course conservation in general. Should we actually set aside land for its own natural habitat, allow therefore the wildlife to survive, or should the man take more and more that land for its own use, which means convert agricultural forest land into habitable land and its impact on the society. We are worrying about global warming right now. And even the Pope finally has a major paper written talking about how all leaders in the society must wake up that global warming is real and it is actually created by human intervention, which is a controversial point, but there's a perspective that is taken that let's wake up now and hopefully by proper intervention within 30 to 40 years we may change the the direction, for example, or we may reduce the total impact that we do as humans on the environment. So and conservation has become a very major global issue and environment by and large. And all of this is done to bring about a change in the magnitude and or the direction of a particular social behavior. My focus always has been about consumption, and therefore I think more from a consumption viewpoint, what changes can be made. For example, I have written articles about how mindful consumption, where consumers are conscious of what they are consuming, can be beneficial to the business. In fact, less consumption may not be less growth for the corporation, which is a non-intuitive view, but the data shows that that can be done properly. We have seen this thing that eating more organic and more healthy food, even though it's more expensive, revenues grow up for companies like Whole Foods and many of the grocery manufacturers who are creating organic products or healthy products by and large, actually are increasing the revenue faster than those who are still offering the traditional products which are somewhat harmful. Latest debate, as you know, is about the hydrogenated oil and therefore the fat that comes in, which is not good for the body because it produces cholesterol, encourages cholesterol, etc. So you intervene as a government policy to ban it, give certain deadlines and say within which time that particular ingredient is just not possible anymore for you to supply, as we have done with many product categories. So consumption is a major activity of human beings, which I study. Or there may be a social movement. Social movement may deal with, obviously, civil rights movements at one time, could deal in fact with movements about more education for the underprivileged people in the society, more fellowships, more student loans, whatever you do, there may be a social movement. And of course, I've also studied boycotts. When a socially activist group actually puts its economic pressure on a product or a company by simply boycotting the product. We have done that with the apartheid movement in South Africa, where many organizations simply said, we will not invest in South African companies because they are actually not reacting against the apartheid policy. And we brought about a massive change in South African economy and its politics and everything. So this is a large definition, but a good one of planned social change. So what are the examples? The new millennium goals established by United Nations, called the triple bottom line, profit, people, planet, as they call it, 3 Ps, is a major initiative. And they're trying to market this initiative to all of the key stakeholders or the doers: government, business, NGOs, foundations. Increasing high school graduation. This is fascinating how in many advanced countries, the graduation rates for high school are so low. Should be 100%, but they are lower than that. What is it that makes a young person drop out of high school? Is it the way we are actually educating them? education. It is the traditional 3 R's of learning: reading, writing, arithmetic. And now talked about how 3 R's has to change to 3 I's of learning. If you make learning interactive, if you make learning individualized, and if you make learning integrated, there is something in common between English literature and chemistry. Why don't we put it together? If we change our whole educational system through active intervention, through policy, through investment, however we do it, maybe the students will be more motivated to complete their high school education rather than drop out of high school education. If students drop out of going to high school graduation because of economic necessity. In many emerging economies, we know that the family needs that young child as a labor. They have to do farm work. They have to do work at home making products, what we call the cottage industries or unorganized sectors. So here is a key conflict between getting education and having an economic survival livelihood for the family, to support the family. How do we intervene and balance the two, or somehow provide some economic measure so the student or the young child cannot be used for child labor, but can actually be sent to school and education as a way out from the poverty? We have seen similarly quite a lot of initiatives about revitalizing cities that have been under rust belt. In America, Midwest is the key place. Many of these cities were really declining because manufacturing left the city. They were basically manufacturing oriented. Detroit would be a good example. Dayton, Ohio would be another example. I can give you a bunch of those examples. Pittsburgh used to be like that as a steel capital. But they have, through active intervention, transformed themselves into high tech, into something else, whatever they are. That's an active intervention with a policy objective in charge of one agency, whatever that agency is all about. So what are the components of this planned social change? First is that there is a social behavior to be changed, is identified and defined. What is the social behavior you want to change? Example is increasing birth rate in Denmark and Singapore. I was so surprised, although I had forecasted 30 years ago that all advanced countries will have an aging problem with declining birth rate. Not only life expectancy is rising, but the birth rate is declining at the same time, and they will have to do some intervention. The market process, evolutionary process, will not solve the population reduction problem. And it is coming to roost now in Japan, in Germany, and in Scandinavia. So Denmark now is encouraging young couples to go on a vacation paid by the government so that they can have more children. So vacation is not for fun, but actually for reproduction, interestingly. And they have got some data that shows that the families go on vacation actually have more birth rates. So they are now finding this fact and then leveraging that as promotional device. It's marketing. They are also in fact giving more maternity leave, not just for the mother or the woman, but also for the man, to say that to raise a child in a nuclear society, there is nobody to support you. There are no grandparents out there living with you as we used to the case. So how do we offer that support so people will have the incentive to have more children? I'm not so positive that this will work. My view is that the horse is out of the barn. It may be a little too late probably. And if you look at the data, Japan being a very homogeneous nation not allowing immigration is actually having a decline in the population count. Germany is about equal. And in the US, we still have a population growth, but that's because of immigration. And many of these countries don't believe immigration is the right policy for their own society by and large. And therefore, how do you encourage your own people to generate more births, essentially, which is what Singapore is going through that, Denmark is going through that, which is fascinating. Policy's second component of a planned social change is that policy objective with respect to magnitude and or direction of change. You have to have certain numerical goals, a measurement about the policy objective that you have. So for example, reducing bottom of the pyramid, or I like the word base of the pyramid population. United Nations defines $2 per day or less income population. If it is 40% now, can we reduce it further, for example? Can we make it half so it is only 20% by 2020? So there are deadlines and there are concrete measures with which you are beginning to track whether your intervention is making a difference or not. That's the second component of a planned social change. Third component is that there is some entity is earmarked as a change agent. Who is in charge? and supplied with appropriate resources and powers. And these entities could be, for example, a regulatory agency like Federal Communications Commission in America, which is now given the responsibility of net neutrality. That means internet access and the bandwidth will be available no matter who offers that. Or universal broadband service as a mandate by the society, by the government. Universal broadband, as it is called, is becoming a reality in all countries, India and China. Think about that one. In fact, our forecast is that India and China will have more universal broadband than some of the advanced countries, including United States. And of course, we have an entity like Red Cross, which has a mission to make sure that when there is a disaster, they are first responders, first rescuers, and get a volunteer force organized. And they're given the power, which means authority to intervene, as well as they are given the resources through fundraising, however they do it. That's the third element. The fourth element is there is one or more program. It's something they are doing as a programmatic intervention. And it could be, for example, just increasing the awareness of the problem as the breast cancer awareness campaigns are going on. You have the running, 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers. They are not just fundraising, but they're actively engaging and increasing the awareness that breast cancer is a very serious and a very large scale phenomenon happening all over the world. Similarly, many large corporations are now encouraging their employees to be active volunteers in their communities. While this was pretty common among semi-public enterprises like the Bell System telephone or the utility companies, they were supposed to be good community citizens. But now it seems like all large corporations believe that their employees ought to have more than just work as the only contribution. Can they also commit themselves to do volunteer work either during the office hours or preferably over the weekends, etc., etc., and is massively appreciated by employees themselves also. So you can see a lot more engagement by the corporation into the community activity, but it's organized. There is a mission, there's a count, and there is somebody who is monitoring what is the benefit to the society. The traditional notions of profit maximization and return to investors is conspicuously absent in all planned social programs. In other words, while the enterprises are primarily driven by profit maximization and a return to their investors, those are the two concepts of a business enterprise, the non-business enterprises which are in charge of this planned social change, usually those are conspicuously absent. In other words, they are rejected. Most change agents for planned social change are non-profit organizations, which is good news, bad news. The good news is that as non-profit status gives them a tax advantage, especially in the United States, they're basically tax-free organizations. Not only that, but people who contribute money to them, or what is called the 3 T's, time, talent, and treasure. But for treasure, which is a tangible monetary contribution, you can calculate. And therefore, they give you tax credit or tax reduction to people who contribute money, for example, the donors. And also, the organization itself does not have to pay tax. For example, most universities which are private are non-profit organizations. If they are non-profit organizations, then government says, we can give you research contracts. We will not give research contracts for profit organizations. So everything is in their favor, which is the good news. The bad news is that often most of these non-profit organizations don't have an understanding of business efficiency, including supply chain, procurement, how to market, etc., etc. So if one can put the business approach without the business objectives, and one can create a hybrid organization, as it is called, I think one can come out with a much better outcome, which is what I would like to emphasize in this lecture. I wanted to also stop here and mention why planned social change is increasingly becoming a necessity. In addition to the main point that I made at the beginning of the lecture, namely that there are enormous side effects of evolutionary changes by technology, by demographics, by globalization, or sometimes government policy that disturbs the ecosystem, and there are side effects. I mean, these are really potent drugs, and therefore one has to look at not only efficacy but side effects. So for example, in countries like Scandinavia, with aging of the population, loneliness is a key consequence. So how do you cope with loneliness? Because if you are lonely, people will use escape mechanism from loneliness. They don't feel belonging any place. Whether those escape mechanisms are alcohol consumption, as it is true in Scandinavia, or whether those are suicides, or those are in fact escaping by taking drugs, these are all side consequences of a societal change, and therefore government actively intervenes, NGOs actively intervene to somehow correct those side effects by and large. Second main area why this is rising enormously is the lack of government funding. Since the first energy crisis of 1978, most governments simply have not had the tax revenues to sustain themselves. The deficit financing that we did after World War II, what is called the Keynesian economics, came to roost. Economy was not doing well. We had a massive restructuring of organizations. Many of the regulated industries were privatized and decentralized, creating a lot of job losses. We engaged in more automation. So the governments simply don't have the money. And at the same time, social obligations are rising because in advanced countries, as we age, people begin to retire quite a lot, and therefore they go on government-funded pensions, government-funded healthcare, and if that's the case, government has no money to do anything else. So there's a need for non-government funded or non-government organizations to step in and see if they can intervene and somehow correct the societal problems created by the side effects of evolutionary changes. Third one, as I mentioned earlier, is growing inequality. This is absolutely incredible to see how in advanced countries like the US, the wage disparity within an organization between the frontline employee who is paid minimum wages, let's say $15 an hour, which is a norm established by the government as a benchmark to shoot for, to the maximum wage paid to the CEO or somebody at the highest level, it is often 100 to 1,000 times difference. It's just not sustainable. Society will resent that kind of an inequality. Will create all kinds of political debates and dialogues. Are you for the middle class or are you for the rich? Are you serving the top 1%? Just goes on and on. So growing inequality is not good for the society. Social media activism has become very new phenomenon. There is a lot of raising about issues that we would usually think it's highly local, but certainly becomes a global attention. So this is increasing enormously need for intervention of some sort. Rise of mega philanthropies. If you thought that the Carnegies and the Mellons and the Rockefellers were big philanthropists in their days, which they were, but today the philanthropy done by Bill Gates and Melinda Gates, for example, Microsoft founder, through Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation, the philanthropy done by Warren Buffett, motivating in fact all of the billionaires to say half of your wealth that you have accumulated and will accumulate ultimately will go to the societal problem solving rather than continue in the family as a heritage. How different that is, think about, than the days of monarchy, where a monarch, a noble family, through land and feudal system will acquire wealth, and the wealth will perpetuate from themselves to their heirs, and they will marry among themselves, and therefore the rich becomes richer and richer. Here it says the richer you are, the more you will contribute back to the society. And this movement is catching on, which is very nice. Not just in the US, but all over the world. For whatever reason, it seems to have struck a chord among the billionaire people in the society, which is therefore creating more opportunities for active intervention. Technology has become a great enabler, especially the digital technology. If we believe that television was a transforming technology, telephone was a transforming technology, railways were transforming technologies, and they were, but nothing like the digital revolution. Especially the cell phone, the smartphone, the internet is massively enabling people to do active intervention in ways we could have never imagined even a decade ago or the turn of the last century. CSR and conscious capitalism, as I mentioned earlier, a book my colleague and I wrote called The Forms of Endearment, actually documented that people who believe in taking care of the stakeholders, especially community, suppliers, employees, rather than being driven by shareholders alone, outperform financially. Totally counterintuitive. Shareholder-driven companies underperform compared to stakeholder-driven companies, which is unthinkable, because our typical stereotype of a business is that let me do the cost cutting by letting go employees. Let me cut corners for my customers by not giving them all of the things that I was giving him for market price competition, whatever the reason is. Let me not invest in the community which gave me so much natural resources, access to the river, access to, whatever infrastructure. Let me exploit that for my own shareholders primarily. Actually, those companies underperform compared to companies that care for the community, care for their employees, care for their customers, and care for their suppliers, their vendors, which is absolutely radical thinking, but that is becoming mainstream now on a worldwide basis. So corporate social responsibility, which is giving back to the society after making money, whereas actually giving to the society back again to shareholders while making money, are two very different platforms. And as you know, in countries like India, CSR is mandated by law. Market failure. If the enlightened corporations don't contribute back, then government will regulate in some fashion. And I'm watching that experiment. 2% of the net income of all for-profit corporations have to set aside their money to show them how they're contributing toward solving societal problems. And there's a whole guidelines, etc. And they have to report that in their annual report, which actually makes them fiduciarily responsible or liable if they are having exaggerated or non-truthful statements. What is happening in India is always possible in any other country if the corporations do not wake up and contribute back to the society. The need for preventive health. More and more we are learning that intervention after the disease has started, like diabetes, hypertension, intervention or correction afterwards is just too expensive. If it's possible to educate the people, it's possible to intervene to prevent the disease even arising, is a much better economic proposition and much better lifestyle proposition. So lots of activities are now taking place by NGOs, by in fact socially active organizations, to educate people, to actually guide them, to counsel them at the school level, for example, at the college level, to say proper diet and exercise is more preventative rather than getting into trouble afterwards. And of course now we have a new volunteer culture. The new millenniums grew up with the idea during their primary and secondary school that you must do community service. In fact, today you cannot go to a top university in the US at least without showing in your resume that during your high school not only you did the AP classes, the advanced understanding of knowledge, college level, but also you have contributed toward some volunteer work. That's your admission standard, not just grades anymore. So this new millennium says they come to college, come with the notion that my responsibility is not only my career alone and a livelihood, but how do I serve the society? So you have this massive force of young people, which says one key resource is talent. Treasure is the money, which comes from these large philanthropies. And of course you have time. So time, talent, treasure comes together in many ways with this new volunteer force. So one can create exciting new active social intervention programs. As I mentioned earlier in the beginning of my lecture, ironically, I was very surprised when I analyzed and I saw the aha that more the societal change, the more the need for planned social change. It's interesting. In other words, the side effects of societal changes are creating enormous opportunities for, or the necessity for, planned social intervention or change. Unfortunately, while the need for planned social change is rising in a much bigger way on a global basis, it is beyond just starving children in Africa or India. It is beyond, in fact, people who are struggling for livelihood or tribal communities all over the world who are displaced by modernization and by immigrants to nations in some fashion. This is now mainstream. It is something that is now a mainstream problem for everybody. So while that is growing as we articulated, the failure rate is equally high. The failure of NGOs, governments, as well as business-led program is very high and often non-sustainable. Most NGOs struggle. They live on this volunteer work, or they live in fact on contributions made by philanthropists, but that's just drying up more and more. So how do you make them self-sufficient, which is the main advocacy I'm taking in this lecture. So we have had consumer protection laws at one time. We had consumer protection movements like Ralph Nader, who became very popular with that movement, wrote a great book called, Unsafe at Any Speed, which was about the automobile industry, and really created a response. Today, nobody pays attention to consumer protection anymore. It was a movement that died out. So how do you create sustainability? Similarly, we have had social entrepreneurship. It is a hot topic for a while, but I'm not so confident that it can be sustained unless the planned social change agent, an NGO, takes a business perspective. In other words, they behave like business without the objective of profit seeking, which is what I talked about. So this is because most planned social change programs do not take the user perspective, first of all, and because they do not treat the recipient of the programs as customers. I'm amazed as I work with NGOs and sit on the boards of some NGOs, I see this elitist attitude. I know what's good for you, and that comes in the way. Rather than understanding why the recipient behaves the way they do, which is harming themselves maybe in the process, harming the community, harming in fact the environment, whatever the causes are, understanding the psychology and motivation, rather than doing that, you say, I will tell you what's good for you. Because most of the NGOs are led by educated people. They haven't come from the struggles of the masses. If they have come from the struggle, they have an empathy. So this elitism gets in the way, my view. Okay? So my view is that the best way to get more out of the planned social change programs in terms of their effectiveness and efficiency is to make them user-centric and treat the recipient of the benefit as a customer, not as somebody poor that I'm going to patronize or I'm going to have a charitable approach. In addition, the change agencies do not embrace business concepts. I'm amazed how anti-business the attitudes are by the professional workers or the volunteers. They all have come with a different set of disciplines and a mistrust of the business as an institution. But they need the business process. I can give an example of one of the large NGOs in India called Akshay Patra, which is a midday lunchtime meal given to children in the school. I think they serve 2.5 million children every day. They prepare the meals. It was linked to at one time that Hare Krishna movement, essentially, very volunteer one. But it was floundering. Government was giving some money as a part of the school children program. But interestingly, it still had a deficit. Till two multi-billionaire entrepreneurs out of the IT industry, the ICT industry as we call it, took charge of that and began to actually make it business efficient. You don't have to change the mission, which is to serve the society, to motivate kids to come to the school, and the farmers and the villagers will send them because they get a free meal. Free meal is the bait or an incentive, but education is the real objective. But the way you do it, the processes, the supply chain, everything you do is more like a business, which is interesting. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with that, because if you look at the modern management education, it all came from the military. Military is the one who learned how to organize logistics or operations research, as we call it. And that's how the modern management principles came. Today, probably the most diverse organization you can ever manage is the American Army, US Army. And how do you manage the diverse people with high school education? So if you wanted to learn about diversity, there is no corporation that knows as well as the US Army, for example. That's a non-profit organization. So my view is that I think this notion that we have in a mindset that if I'm an NGO, if I'm a charity organization, if I'm a volunteer organization, I should be not trusting the business processes. I agree, one does not have to trust business objectives, but one can trust business processes. And therefore, most of these NGOs do not know how to generate reserves, surplus, or in fact profit in many ways, which is why right now in real time most of the hospitals are collapsing. They're either community hospitals, government hospitals, faith-based hospitals, and they basically are unable to support themselves because the funding done by the government through medical assistance, Medicare, Medicaid, or by the insurance companies is collapsing with the new law that is passed called the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare. So right now we are going through massive consolidation because they can't survive. They never figured out how to run their hospitals in a business fashion. In fact, it's anti-business in many ways. So that is the other part that I wanted to add. So here is a fundamental change that needs to be made. All NGOs from a provider perspective should be thinking more and more from the user or the recipient perspective, taking a customer-centric approach. And from the traditional charity mission, I mean, most faith groups have charity missions in emerging markets in Latin America, Central America, Africa. They take the mission there, right? But charity mission has to change to sustainability mission. How do I make sure that my church will survive in the long term serving the society? Which means how do I have a business understanding in the way I manage my operations, in the way I serve, in the way I treat volunteers, which are basically like semi-employees, and in the way I raise funds or donors, etc. So this is what we'll be focusing on as we continue the journey about planned social change.
Thanks for listening to this lecture, part 1 of User-Centric Marketing for Planned Social Change with Professor Jagdish Sheth. For more about Professor Sheth and the Sheth Leadership Academy, visit www.shethleadershipacademy.com.